Okay, thanks, John. Thank you all for joining today. As you all now know, today is President's Day. Washington's birthday on the 22nd, and Abraham Lincoln's birthday on February 12th, born in 1809. Also, as you know, I've studied Lincoln and read about him for now over 60 years, and I've collected a lot of material. And I've had lots of talks and programs on various topics. Some things I've talked about regarding Lincoln is his youth and his growing up in the prairies and in the wilderness, also about his work as a laborer and a rail splitter. I've even given programs on the women in his life, a substantial number of women that were influential to him. Also a program on his history and his career as a lawyer and as a politician, a very shrewd politician as it happens. Also programs about him as a war president and as a speaker. But as I got to thinking about this today, I realized that I really had deeply thought about his intellect. How did he become so articulate, thoughtful, wise? How did he become such a speaker when you consider the real meager background that he came from? I mean, truly a child of the frontier and the wilderness. His mother was Nancy Hanks, and she was illegitimate, clearly established. The man that was her father and married her mother was not her father. And she couldn't read or write even to the end of her life. But she did tell Abraham Lincoln and his sister Sarah Bible stories. She had to do them orally because she couldn't read. His father Thomas was an honest person. He was hardworking. He owned property. He served on jurors, which was really something in the frontier areas, because you had to own property and be of some means. He was also in church and community, different positions. He's also a storyteller, and that's where Abe Lincoln got a lot of his stories. But he wasn't much further along than Nancy in terms of reading and writing, as Abraham himself said later in life that his father could only bunglingly sign his name. And they were really estranged later in life. Lincoln was born in 1809, as I said. That was only 20 years after the Constitution was adopted, and only 33 years after the Declaration of Independence. Two of the people that signed the Declaration and the Constitution were still alive. And when he served in Congress for one term, he served with John Quincy Adams. So that's how far back that history goes and how young our country was. But how did this child of the wilderness learn, and how did he grow, and how did he advance? Where he was born in Kentucky, Hodgenville was south of Louisville, a place called Sinking Springs Farm. Later, they moved 8 miles away to the Pigeon Creek Farm. At age 7, in the wintertime, matter of fact, Thomas loaded them up, moved them 100 miles into the wilderness across the Ohio River into Indiana. True wilderness. It was not even a state. It was a territory. Very few people, very few homes. They often talked about bears and wolves and Indians in the neighborhood. After a few years, it did increase a little bit. And at one point, they ended up having 49 kids in that neighborhood. But schooling, very little schooling. Mostly it was by itinerant teachers or preachers. Often it was a preacher traveling through the country, would take up collections to teach kids for a few months. Or if they had a school of any kind, they had a couple in Kentucky that Lincoln went to briefly, 3 in Indiana that he went to briefly, but it was by subscription. Parents had to pay before you go to school, like tuition today. If you didn't have the money, and of course the kids didn't go to school. And once they had them, they didn't have any resources or supplies. as Lincoln often said, it was the nature of the schools were blab schools. Blab, either they repeated what teacher said to them, or sometimes they would have a Bible or a book and they would just read, take turns reading sentences or parts from those books. Attendance was really intermittent. For Lincoln, in addition to that, his father had him at home clearing land, especially in Indiana, clearing land, working for others. And as was the custom in those days, his father got all his income. If he worked all day splitting rails or pulling corn or doing whatever for neighbors, his dad got all the money until he was 21. On top of all this, living out in the wilderness in Indiana, his mother died. He was only age 9. 2 years after they moved there, in 1818, she died from milk sickness that came from cows eating snake root plants. Indiana wasn't even a state. It finally became a state that year in 1818. So after his mother died, Thomas decided, they need to have a mother. He needed to have a wife. So he went back to Kentucky. He went back to get Sarah Bush Johnson, who was a widow, and basically said, "You're a widow, I'm a widower, and we ought to get together," and persuade her to marry him. But the problem is he left those kids actually in that place in Indiana. When they started in Indiana, is what they called a half-face camp. It was like a lean-to, 3 sides with canvas or skins hung over the fourth side. By the time he left, they did have a fourth wall and a solid cabin, but it was wood floors, no windows, one door. And when he went back to Kentucky to pick up his new wife or to get married, he left those kids alone. It was Abraham, age 9, Sarah, aged 11, and Dennis Hanks, their cousin, who lived with them almost all the rest of his life. And he was 14 or 15, but those kids lived alone for 2 months in the wilderness in that cabin. Probably had a few neighbors that they could rely on. Thomas picked up Sarah Bush Johnson and married her, but he first had to pay off her debts because she said she had some debts. He cleared them up, paid them for her, moved her and her 3 children across the river, 100 miles back to Indiana, where the cabin was. Her comment when she saw these kids, you can imagine 2 months living out in the wilderness in a cabin with wood dirt floors. She described these kids as wild, almost like wild animals, unkempt, dirty, dirt floor, no windows. The first 2 things she ordered Thomas to do was put in a wood floor and a window. I say that, and I tell you that just to give you a background of thinking about what Lincoln became and where he came from. That's amazing. The one thing that was beneficial to him especially was when Sarah came, she brought books and she encouraged his reading. He did go to school for a month or 2, a school there called the Little Pigeon School. Again, another blab school or subscription school. Sarah, when she was interviewed later in life, often talked about how Lincoln read everywhere, outdoors, at the house, in the fields, reading all the time when he could find a book. He didn't like physical labor, but he was diligent for knowledge, she said. And he learned by listening. When they had company, had visitors or people, adults talking, he would be in the background listening intently. And she said he didn't interrupt, didn't do anything until after people left. And then he'd have all kinds of questions about the topics they talked about. One of the famous stories about him and his reading is one of the first books he read and had was a book about the life of Washington by a man by the name of Pastor Weems. He borrowed it from a neighbor, slept in the loft in the cabin, tucked it between the logs in his loft, and it rained and the book got wet and destroyed the book. So he went back to the neighbor to return it and tell him what had happened. In order to pay for the book, he pulled the corn stalks for fodder for 3 days to pay for that book. Sarah often talked about, about his reading. And Tom wasn't too happy about it because he was always, if we went out to check on him, he was under a tree or on a log or sitting on a fence reading. And she said Tom never made him quit reading to do the work. Tom would just do it himself. And she also said Tom taught him to work, but he never learned to love it, physical labor. And he did a lot of it because he was hired out to neighbors, laying clearing for his dad. And his dad kept all his wages. Talking about his education, when he became president, especially when he was running for president, when people would ask him, he'd often say, well, I went to school by littles, amounting to less than a year. And when he was president, somebody from New York interviewed him and said, tell us about your education. He gave him one word. He said, my education was defective. I've only found one comment in all the reading I've done about his heritage as a factor. As you know, his mother was illegitimate, couldn't read or write. But there is one story that's documented, and it's by his partner, Billy Herndon. And this is what he said about his ancestry. I don't know who my grandfather was, and I'm much more concerned to know what his grandson will be. But he did tell Billy Herndon a story. They were lawyers, they were riding on the circuit out in the particular county, going to one of the courthouses, and out of the blue, he said to his partner, Billy Herndon, who was quite a bit younger, got to talking about his ancestry. And there's this book, I have a book called Founder's Son by Richard Brookhiser, who's editor of the National Review. He says, Lincoln revealed an astonishing thing. He said, my grandmother, her eventual husband, was not the man she married, and not an ordinary farmer like the other Hankses and Lincolns, but a well-bred Virginia farmer or planter, a broad-minded, unknown Virginian. He later explained that he believed that he derived his brains and ambition, his better nature and his finer qualities via that heredity. The finer qualities, in other words, as Brookhiser says, came straight from his maternal grandfather, skipping Thomas Lincoln entirely. That's the only reference I've ever found about that he ever mentioned about the possible heredity in his genes. The thing about Lincoln's time in Indiana, as I said, from 1818, when his mother died, until 1830, age 21, when they moved to Illinois, there's hardly any history about him or about his schooling. The only thing we know is that he mimicked preachers, he mimicked politicians. He would get on a stump and verbatim repeat sermons, speeches he'd heard for his adolescent friends. And that's about all we know about those years that he spent in Indiana, other than the hard work. As I said, he and his father became estranged after they moved to Illinois, and when he was 21, excuse me, he left home. And maybe his distaste for labor, or maybe even his distaste for slavery, is when he worked for his father and his neighbors and then got no benefit. All the money went to his father. One thing that I would say that it's a story from Indiana. It's a true story. One of the things he did was he had a rowboat. They were close to the Ohio River, and people would ask to be rowed across the river, or sometimes rowed to the middle of the river so they could catch a riverboat. So he did that on his own. Well, he got sued when he was about 18 or 19. There were two brothers that had a ferry business in that same location, ferrying people across the river and ferrying them to the middle of the river to riverboats for fees. And they claimed Lincoln was taking their money and interfering with their trade. So they sued him in in Kentucky. He defended himself. He was just a young kid, 18, 19. And he went to the magistrate's court and defended himself. And he so impressed the magistrate with his arguments. His argument was that I'm not rowing across the river. The license that those guys had for their ferry was to cross the river. I'm not crossing the river. I'm just rowing to the middle of the river to river boats. So the statute and the rule and the law and the licensing doesn't apply to me. He so impressed that magistrate that he let Lincoln call on his daughter, and then he invited him to come look at law books in his library, in his office in Kentucky. That was probably his first exposure to law and about the legal system, and to books, of course. He developed, really all we know is that he read a lot while in the fields and other places. He developed a sense of humor that came from his father. He listened and he questioned. History shows, and he documented this along with his stepmother, some of the books that he read were the one on the life of Lincoln by Parson Weems, Aesop's Fables, the Bible he read constantly from cover to cover. And as Carl Sandburg said later in life, Lincoln could quote anywhere, any topic and any subject from the Bible. He knew it better than anyone he ever read about. So he read a lot. Pilgrim's Progress is one of the books he read, Robinson Crusoe, hymnals, newspapers. Later, he read poetry. He read Shakespeare, William Knox, Robert Burns, Lord Byron. And he read books on American and British history when he could find them. He especially connected with Thomas Paine, famous author and pamphleteer from the Revolution. And a lot of his themes and ideas for speeches came from Paine's Common Sense and some other things that Paine wrote. As I said, when he got to Illinois and moved with his father, and after age 21, he left and he never went back. In fact, he was so estranged from his father that I don't think, ever saw him again. When his father became ill later in life, one of his stepbrothers wrote to him and said, "You should come visit." Lincoln said basically it wouldn't do me any good and wouldn't do him any good either. He didn't attend his father's funeral, never thought about or considered a tombstone or anything like that for his father. Didn't go see him when he was ill or died, although he did go see his stepmother before he went to Washington. When he left his father's home, of course, as history shows, he took a job rafting pigs down the river, down to New Orleans from New Salem, where he had landed. And it was his first exposure to slavery. He later in life wrote about that experience in New Orleans in particular, walking by the slave market. He came back and he was offered his job as a store clerk. And that's important because it gave him access to newspapers and books and travelers. And he was like a sponge in that store. When he didn't have customers and when he wasn't waiting on people, he was reading whatever he came across. And then he bought the store together with a partner by the name of William Berry, who basically drunk up all the profits and left Lincoln with a debt of the store. As he put it, the store winked out. Then he referred to the loan he had and the money he had as the national debt. And after he became a lawyer, it took him years to pay off. It was $1,200 or $1,500, but he eventually paid it off. While he was in that store, though, he found books on mathematics and on surveying. He taught himself, again, how energetic he was and how much he thought about learning. So he taught himself to be a surveyor and got a job as a surveyor for the county. And he was helped by a town official to get that job. He was also helped at that time by a person by the name of Mentor Graham in New Salem, who was a teacher, who gave him books on grammar and other books that he had from his library. Then about that same time, he got the job as a part-time clerk at the post office in New Salem. Again, he had papers to read, he had books available. He ran it till it closed down, and they moved the post office to Springfield. While he was there in that store and in the post office, one time he found a barrel of books that some traveler had left behind. And it contained Black's commentaries on the law and also Indiana statutes. And he read those, got him really interested in the law. And that's when he decided to run for the legislature. He ran in 1832 and lost, but he had almost all the votes from New Salem. Then in 1834, he won election to the legislature. But he didn't have any money to even have a suit. Someone had to loan him the money to buy a suit so he could go to Vandalia, the state capital, to serve in the legislature. He was a captain in the Black Hawk War for a couple of months. And his only comment about that was, I had lots of battles with mosquitoes. And I bent my rifle one time, but that was the most dangerous part of his experience. He was elected captain, even though he was one of the youngest people in that unit. And for that service, he eventually got a deed or a land grant from the government for some land in Crawford County, Iowa, which he never saw and never utilized. He was truly a self-taught man at that point and a lifelong learner. One of the things he admitted and said that when he was in the legislature, he spent much time nosing around in the state law library or state library, researching Washington, the founders of our republic. That library also had a set of James Madison's papers, I assume a copy of some kind, including James Madison's copious notes. Lincoln studied those and read those and used those from that point on in speeches, especially when he started in politics. He did serve one term in Congress in 1847, and he himself often said that he spent much time at the Library of Congress, again, nosing around. Eventually, he was asked, when he was in the legislature, he served with John Stuart, who also had served with him in the Black Hawk War. So John Stuart asked him and invited him to read law with him. So that's what he did. He went to Springfield, walked back and forth at the beginning to read law with Stuart. Someone asked me the other day, I was talking to a friend of mine, he said, well, where did Lincoln go to college? And I had to laugh because he's about as far from going to college as you could get. And certainly as far from law school as you could get. As some of you may know, up until the middle of the 20th century, you could still read law and become a lawyer, even in Iowa, without going to law school. I think it changed in the 1950s, I think, or 40s. But Lincoln, for example, once you felt able and ready, you could go before a panel of lawyers who questioned your ability, your character, and they could recommend to the Supreme Court whether you be admitted to the practice of law or not. And he was in about 1842. I thought at this point, I was reading and I got to thinking about his wit. There's a book called Lincoln's Wit and Wisdom. It's also a very good book, because he really was a great storyteller. He got lots of it from his father, lots of it from the people he associated with in the wilderness, and he remembered everything. And I just give you a couple examples. One of the stories he talked about was a little boy sitting in the step, and a mud puddle in front of him. He was moving the mud around. He said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm making a church." Well, see, here's the steeple, and here's the roof, and here's the doors, and here's the people. And he said, "Well, where's the preacher?" And the preacher said, "Well, I ain't got," or the little boy said, "I ain't got enough mud to make a preacher." Another one of his famous quotes back then, I guess he regaled his fellow lawyers on the circuit with jokes almost every night, to the point where they would, he was the master of ceremonies and their entertainment. I see Chuck Boffenberger asked a question about land in Greene County for Lincoln. I've heard that he owned land or had land someplace else in Iowa besides Crawford County, but I've never been able to document that or establish that. And it might have been, I don't think it was Greene County, might have been in southeast Iowa, but I don't know that that's factual. Another one of his great puns was, and he used it as he did a lot of times, examples to make points. He said, "What kills the skunk is the publicity it gives itself." If you think about that, that's a great comment. Another story he told, because people talked about his appearance, because he was pretty homely. He's pretty shaggy. He was pretty much a rube when he went to legislature. Short pants, long coat, messed up hair, messed up shirt. And one of the jokes he told was this. He had a knife. He said, "I have this special knife. One day I met a man on the road, and the man gave it to me. And he said, I swore if I ever met a man uglier than me, I'd give it to him. Here, sir, you have won it fairly." And I have some more of those that hopefully I can get to later. When you consider his intellect, I got to think about this. You don't need to look at what he said. You only need to look at what he said and his speeches, because he never wrote a book. He never kept a diary. He never had any memoirs. And one of his lawyer friends said, because he rode that circuit for 16 years, and the lawyer said, despite his rube-looking appearance and his persona, any man who took him for a simple-minded man would soon wake up with his back in a ditch. Lincoln often said himself about his mind and his intellect, "My mind is kind of like a steel plow or a piece of steel. It takes a long time to scratch anything into it. But once it's scratched in there, it's awful hard to rub it out." And that does sum up his intellect, I think, a lot. I thought about some ample examples of his eloquence. And I thought about some of the famous speeches. And this is what started me. And I'm sorry to give so much background, but I wanted to talk about what low circumstances he came from, but what he accomplished in politics and in life and in his business. I thought there were probably 4 or 5 speeches that I thought about that were important. And I got to looking at Google, and it turns out that Google people had about the same speeches that I had. And I'll just give you a list of them, then I'm going to read some of those. First one was in 1838. He gave a speech to the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield on the preservation of our political institutions. 1850, a memorable speech to a group of young lawyers. And he told them, one of the things he said was, never stir up litigation. A worse man can scarcely be found. Also, be honest if you're a lawyer. If you can't be honest as a lawyer, then resolve to be honest and find some other profession. In 1858, he gave the House divided speech that I'll talk about at the Republican convention in 1858, when they nominated him to run for Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. In 1860 is a speech that made him president, a lot of people said. It was called the Cooper Union speech. And then in his first inauguration was a famous speech, as well as his second message to Congress in 1862. His second inauguration is a very famous speech, inscribed on lots of monuments all over the country. In this book, The Founder's Son by Richard Brookhiser, here's what he said about Lincoln's ability in words. Words alone do not win wars or lead men, but what words could do, Lincoln's would. Brookhiser also went on to say, but he made his mark as a politician by communication. He would never have been able to do anything so memorable and right if he had not said so many memorable, true words. His words remain timely even today, including his most famous speech at Gettysburg. But here are some of his words. The first one is from the Lyceum meeting in 1838. And think about these words in contrast or in comparison to what's happened in our country in the last year or so. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches us, it must spring from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must observe ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Whenever the vicious portion of our population shall be permitted to gather in bands of hundreds and thousands and burn churches, ravage and rob provision stores, throw printing presses into rivers, shoot editors, and hang and burn obnoxious persons at pleasure and with impunity, depend on it, this government cannot last. He warned that the tyrant could overtake the U.S. and says that towering genius scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor. It thirsts and burns for distinction. It will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and its laws, and generally intelligent to frustrate his designs. Distinction will be his paramount object. This is a tyrant. And although he is willingly, perhaps more so, acquire it by doing good as harm, yet that opportunity being past and nothing left to be done, he was set boldly to task of pulling it down. He went on to say, we need to cultivate a political religion that emphasizes reverence for the laws and puts reliance on reason, cold, calculating, impassioned reason. Another quote I found that he made about the same time, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. The next speech that I thought was notable was his House Divided speech. That was in 1858 when he ran against Douglas for Senate. It was at the Republican State Convention where he was nominated. Many of his friends thought his speech was way too radical and considered it courageous but politically incorrect. And he basically started out the speech with the most famous part of it. If we could first know where we are and whether we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since the policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government will endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Brookhiser in his book points out that half of those quotes came from the Bible, Matthew chapter 12 and Mark chapter 3. Lincoln often did that in his speeches. The speech that made him president, as people said, is the Cooper Union speech in 1860. He was invited to New York and gave this speech. And this is another one of the famous quotes. This is part of what he said. You will not abide the election of a Republican president, coming to the South. In that supposed event, you say you will destroy the Union. And then you say the great crime of having destroyed it will be upon us. That's cool. A highwayman holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be the murderer. Great line. To be sure, what the robber demanded of me, my money, was my own, and I had a clear right to keep it, but it was no more my own than my vote is my own. And the threat of death to me to extort my money and the threat of destruction to the Union to extort my vote can scarcely be distinguished in principle. In other words, trying to steal my vote is as bad as stealing my money. And this is a famous line that really made him famous. Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government, nor of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it. His response after that speech, I have to find this in another book. In the book called The Wit and Wisdom of Lincoln, after he was president and cries for emancipation came about, and he had ruined the chances for a victory. Here's what he said. If I had to draw a pen across my record and erase my whole life from sight, and if I had one poor gift or choice left as to what I would save from the wreck, I should choose that speech and leave it to the world unerased. That's how important he thought it was. In his first inauguration, he talked about the impending problems. He said one of the more declared objects for ordaining and establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. He goes on to say, acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to the circumstances. I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed. I deem it only a simple duty on my part. I trust this will be regarded as not as a menace, but only as a declared purpose of the Union that I will constitutionally defend and maintain. The central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in constraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily the deliberate changes of popular opinion and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of the free people. Whoever rejects it is rejecting the majority principle. Anarchy and despotism in some form is all that's left. The founders and the same people who wisely given their public service but little power for mischief, and have with equal wisdom provided for the return of that little to their own hand by very short intervals. While the people retain their virtue and vigilance, no administration, by any extreme wickedness or folly, can very seriously injure the government in the short space of 4 years. He concluded this speech, which is his first inauguration. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may be strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic courts of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. And then he gave a speech, a message to Congress in his second annual speech. He didn't go there to talk to them. It was always done in writing. And he said this: we cannot escape history. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. And of course, His second inauguration address is one that's inscribed on lots of monuments. And he ended it by saying this: with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right that God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who has shall borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which we may achieve, and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and all nations. Most of this, according to Brookhiser, is based on scripture, Psalm 147 and James, the book of James, chapter 1. And finally, probably the greatest speech ever written in the English language, in my opinion. I want to ask you to close your eyes and listen to these words. Just close your eyes. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Approximately 252 words, and there are books written about this speech. One of them is by Professor Gary Wills. The book is 250 pages long. On the speech, it was only 252 words. Anyway, that's my take on Lincoln's intellect, where it came from and where it ended up. Well, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jed.
Questions?
Jed, did you ever, I mean, I didn't hear anything, but he just had to have such inner drive to continue to improve himself and to learn. And I mean, it's one thing to go down a path of words, but then he teaches himself to be a surveyor, which is a totally different kind of thing. I mean, he just had such a thirst. It's, I wish we could bottle that.
When he taught himself to be a lawyer, in addition.
Yep.
And when you think where he came from, really, truly the frontier and wilderness, a wilderness child.
That speech about killing editors and destroying their type and all that came right after the assassination of Elijah Lovejoy,
That's right. Lovejoy.
abolitionist editor in Illinois.
Yeah, Alton, Illinois, I think.
Yeah.
They killed him through his press in the river.
Yep.
Yeah. So that phrase from Shakespeare about killing all the lawyers is wrong. We just kill all the editors.
Get in line.
Jed, in modern history, has anybody tried to analyze Lincoln's innate abilities mentally? If he had a photographic memory or if he was a genius? I know it's hard to go back for somebody that you can't visit with and study, but they could study the writings and
Well, I'm sure there are books because at one point, there were as many books. The only book that outsold Lincoln books over the span of history in the United States is the Bible.
Yep.
There's still 200 or 300 books every year on Lincoln. So I'm sure people have made that analysis. And I think personally, I think he had a photographic memory because he could come up with stories on the spur of the moment. One of the stories that I didn't read to you is about Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. It's about a little boy when he was in school. He told the story about a little boy. They had to each take turns reading a passage from the Bible. And one little boy got to the point about the fiery furnace, and he couldn't say those words, those names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the teacher slapped him on the head, made the kid cry. They kept reading and came around to him again, and the kid started to wail and cry like crazy. And the teacher said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, there's come those damn three fellers again." And Lincoln told that story in the White House, and as he told it, he turned around and pointed out the window, and here came Senators Wilson, Sumner's, and I can't remember the third one. And he said, "There's those same three damn fellows coming again." Because they came every day to bug him about emancipation, and he just got tired of hearing. They were true radicals and abolitionists. But that was his story about being bothered by those same damn three fellows again.
understand he could keep a crowd just in the palm of his hand by telling stories and the comedic effects that he was able to enlist.
Well, there's stories about him on the circuit because it was the 8th Circuit in Illinois, 8 counties. And there are stories about him keeping all the lawyers and the judges up half the night telling stories. And they'd get to bed at midnight or later, and they'd all be groggy the next morning because they'd stayed up so late. And someone talked about how their ribs hurt so much they'd laugh so hard.
Jed, you told a story about him being a partner in a store and having to pay off what he called the federal debt. Where did Lincoln stand on the centralized banking system, or what now is the Federal Reserve?
You know, and I should know that answer because that was a very hot issue when he was a young man. And the people like Andrew Jackson. Rick, wasn't Andrew Jackson that fought it and canceled it?
Yeah, Andrew Jackson was against the national debt, and Nicholas Biddle was the head of the national bank, and they were bitter enemies.
And I think that's why Lincoln didn't like Jackson, especially.
There are some people that theorize that every assassination of a president was because of their opposition to a centralized banking system, and they could not overcome that power.
Well, I don't agree with that necessarily because I think Lincoln was assassinated for an entirely different reason. and
It's
in fact,
in his personal life that he had so little control over Mary Todd, who, as I've read, damn near bankrupted him, buying fancy clothes and white gloves and things for the White House when she was the first lady.
and that's true. In fact, there was one point where Secretary of the Treasury or somebody came to him with these bills that Mary had run up, and Lincoln just went to his desk and wrote a check, paid it himself. And that's the kind of man he was. Same way when he practiced law, he would divide up the fees, put it aside, and that's the other guy's half the fee, and always kept it that way. But he paid for some of Mary's excesses.
Jed, remind me, what is the Lincoln connection to Mount Pleasant, Iowa? Was Mary Todd from there?
No, Robert Todd Lincoln, the only Lincoln child that survived, married Mary Harlan, Senator Harlan's daughter.
Okay, that's right.
From Mount Pleasant. In fact, there are no living relatives, descendants of Lincoln. And when Robert died and his children died, there was a large trust, a large sum of money that went to Wesleyan College in Mount Pleasant. And Robert Lincoln and his wife visited Mount Pleasant numerous times, many times. That was the connection.
Uh-huh.
Harlan, James Harlan was a good friend of Lincoln's. He appointed him, I think, Secretary of the Interior or something like that. But they were good friends, and he relied on Harlan for a lot of advice.
Thank you, Jed,
Okay, thank you.
and thank you, Chuck, for joining us. Always great to have
Bet.